Hi guys, welcome to Love and Lust Audiobooks channel, updated daily with great audiobooks, so please subscribe to me if you don't want to miss it.
Well, let's go to read this book, The Alpha's Orphaned Mate Part 4, Chapter 31 to 40.
Chapter 31. Visions from the goddess. Gabe. Edwina's temple was the last place I wanted to be. I hadn't slept properly in days, and my mind was plagued with uncertainty that bordered on paranoia. I had never doubted Val in my life, but Isolde's accusation clung to me like a curse. I couldn't get the image of his hands on my mate out of my head. It was my fault they were spending so much time together. I had asked Val to watch after Estelle as soon as she'd arrived. Maybe that was a mistake. It was my own fault if she was growing too affectionate with him. It was also my fault that Val was spending so much time away from Lucky. He was crazy about her, but maybe his loneliness was enough for him to... So they were just becoming friends, which was a good thing. Estelle was just as close, if not closer, to Lucky as she was to Val. I was being paranoid, I knew that, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop picturing them together. Every time I closed my eyes, my treacherous mind conjured images of Estelle in his arms. I tried to shake the idea from my head. Isolde had clearly been lying. She couldn't look me in the eye, and she wouldn't elaborate on what she claimed to see. I'd been going in these circles for days. I trusted Val and Estelle. I doubted my trust. I couldn't get anything done with these intrusive thoughts hounding me. So here I was at Edwina's temple. I had faith in the moon goddess, but Edwina and I had never seen eye to eye. When I'd begun to fight for our territory, she had warned me that I was in danger. I was successful despite her protests, and she'd been bitter ever since. But right now, I needed someone that I knew for certain I could trust, and Edwina was my father's sister. I knew that she would keep my confidence. The cloying scent of herbs and smoke stuck in my lungs as I entered the small, dimly lit building. There were a few people inside, and I felt their eyes on me as I entered. No one would have expected to see me here. I didn't blame them for being surprised. I walked directly into the back room where I knew Edwina would be. Alpha, she said in greeting. She was sitting on a mat on the floor, surrounded by brightly burning candles. I expected you sooner. I'm not here about Estelle, I said. Edwina would have to be involved in Estelle being officially named Luna, so I'm sure she had been expecting to see me sooner or later. Aren't you? She asked. Her voice was so smug, I wanted to turn and walk back out. I grit my teeth and forced myself to speak. I'm here seeking the guidance of the goddess. I appreciate the effort, she said, but we're beyond that kind of formality, don't you think? We are, I agreed. I sat across from her and looked her over. She was so much older than I remembered her. Her pale blonde hair had gone chalk white, and there were deep lines in her stern face. Her dark blue eyes were locked on me, probably examining me the way I was her. You look like your father, she said. After a long silence, her expression softened, and she sighed sadly. What do you need, Gabriel? I need help. I confessed something strange is happening, and I can't figure it out. Between the visions the goddess is sending to the pack and the border breaches, I just can't make heads or tails of the situation. I'm flattered you came to me, she said. Edwina put on her cryptic wise woman act with everyone else, but I was glad she didn't see the need to play that role with me. Someone is sneaking across the border. I don't know how or why. Despite increasing security, no one has been caught. I don't know who I can trust. She nodded thoughtfully. Well, first things first, Gabriel, you do know who you can trust. We've had this argument before. I know, I muttered. You think I ignore my instincts? You do, she said forcefully. She took a deep breath and shook her head. Gabriel, you are a born alpha, and you are no longer a child. You know your pack better than anyone, and you know what is best for us. You must stop letting the elders interfere. She scrunched her nose in distaste. I will forever be grateful to Valentine for convincing you to push back at Charles once in a while. I wish you'd do it more. I sneered at the mention of Val. I'm not here to talk about that.
Then what do you want to talk about? She sounded exasperated.
Something bad is coming, I said. The pack is at risk. I don't know what it is, but I know that there's danger. Are you asking me for a vision? She sounded genuinely surprised.
I'm asking for your insight. I said if Edwin had prayed to the goddess for a vision, it might help me to understand what was happening.
It was a lot to ask of her. The energy it took exhausted her. And she made no secret of the fact that the things she saw sometimes disturbed her. The star will fall to earth and expose the root of deception. When the root is exposed, we can sever it. She recited, Iris and corals prophesy. Is that what you're concerned about? That's part of it. I said, what does it mean?
I suspect you already know, but I'll help you anyway. The name Estelle means star. Her analytical eyes were locked on me as she spoke.
Estelle's arrival is going to expose a traitor in the pack, I said softly. I had suspected that was the meaning, but it was hard to accept.
You're as sharp as ever, she said.
It makes sense. Whoever is breaching our borders wouldn't be able to do it without inside help.
Well, I had to force myself to unclench my jaw. The idea that someone in the pack would betray us and put our safety in jeopardy enraged me. After all we'd been through, how could anyone be so cruel? Your mate is receiving dreams from the goddess, she said matter-of-factly.
I am aware, I said. Estelle had told me about her strange dreams.
They're connected.
I stared at her in confusion. The memories she is reliving involve our traitor.
I don't know who it is, but the goddess has been reaching out to us. The messages are all connected, even if we can't put the pieces together yet. I rubbed my temple and tried to remember what Estelle had told me about the dreams. They're memories of being chased by someone she can't see, I said.
The dreams will keep coming, she said, and they'll be hard for her to understand. You should send her to me. I can help. She sounded sincere. I had no reason to doubt that she would be able to help, but I was hesitant to bring Estelle to her. There was a line that I wasn't ready to cross, and bringing Estelle to meet my only living relative would cross that line. She must have a close connection to the goddess to be getting these visions, Edwina said seriously. I nodded thoughtfully. I hadn't considered that, but it made sense. Not just anyone could receive visions from the goddess. That's what made the Radcliffe twins so unique, and it's what qualified Edwina to be our priestess. If Estelle really was favored by the goddess, then it went even further to prove her fitness to be our Luna. She was everything this pack needed to heal the wounds that I couldn't address. Had I really ruined that for everyone by driving her away? Eddie, I said softly. Her demeanor shifted at my use of the old nickname. I bit my lip, then hid my face in my hand. I can't stop doubting myself. What if Estelle isn't who I think she is? What if I'm wrong, and bringing her here unravels all of the work I've done to rebuild? I couldn't bring myself to ask the real question that was plaguing me. What if she's exactly what we need? But I'm not the right man for her. Why are you so scared? She reached for my arm and I didn't move away. What's put this doubt in your mind? There's always doubt in my mind, I confessed. Edwina rubbed my arm comfortingly and I wanted to lean into the touch, but didn't dare. The suspicion about Val and Estelle was driving me mad. I couldn't stop thinking about it. If it were true, then it confirmed all of my self-doubts. I was brash and angry and violent, and Estelle would be perfectly justified in choosing a kind, patient man like Val over me. Gabriel, Edwina said gently, I know that you are conflicted. You need to let yourself be the good man that you are and stop worrying about keeping up this mythology you've built around yourself. Your image as a cold, brutal warrior is well earned.
but it's not all that you are.
I can't, I said. If I show any weakness, the pack will be in danger. Look at how we were treated before I started to fight back. I didn't say stop fighting, she said sternly, but you need to choose your fights more wisely. If you try to battle the whole world, you'll get crushed. Not everything has to be a fight, Gabe. I shook my head and I could feel emotions welling up and threatening to overwhelm me. I did everything I could to swallow them back down. It does for me. She let out a defeated sigh and patted my arm gently. I'll see what I can do about a vision for you, she said, and I'll see what I can see about anyone behaving oddly. Edwina had her own channels in the village that she could use to look for anything out of place. She had eyes and ears everywhere. If someone was breaching the borders, she'd be able to find out. Thank you, I said sincerely. She let go of my hand and sat back. But Gabriel, she said seriously, you may not like what you learn. Prepare yourself for that. I nodded and got to my feet. Tell me as soon as you know something. You take care too, she said. She smiled sadly at me, and I turned and hurried out. She worried about me, and part of me felt bad for keeping her at such a distance. I had far too many things on my mind to address those complicated feelings right now. So I pushed them aside. I needed space to think. I walked quickly toward home. No one tried to approach me. The look on my face must have shown that it would be a mistake to do so. As I entered the house, I could smell rum and chocolate. My wolf whined in protest as I walked past the library. I paused at the door as I heard Estelle's voice. I frowned. She'd cried out, but it wasn't in distress or surprise. My stomach twisted. I tried to tell myself to keep walking, but I couldn't. The gnawing suspicion was too much. I went back and pushed the library door open. Ice flooded through my veins. As my adrenaline spiked, I snarled as I looked at Val and Estelle on the small leather couch near the fireplace, locked in a tight embrace. Chapter 32, The Last Child. Val. Gabe and I were in the parlor with two guards who had rushed the house just at dawn. The men were nervous and kept looking down at their feet as they stood before us. I couldn't blame them. Something strange was going on with Gabe. He was facing straight forward and glaring. I could see the tension in his jaw, and I knew that he was angry. I just had no idea why. I wasn't in the best mood myself. I'd hardly slept the night before. What is it, Gabe demanded. Just as the sun was rising, we saw a figure running across the border out of the village. The taller of the men said, he looked pale and glanced at the other guard as he spoke. It looked like a wolf, but it just didn't make sense, Alpha. There was no scent. If I hadn't happened to look over, there would have been no sign that anyone was there. They were like a ghost. No one can mask our scent that well. Gabe said, you must have missed something. Alpha, the second man said. I raised an eyebrow at him. It was bold to interject like that. It seemed like he was trying to divert Gabe's attention from his friend. We ran after them as soon as we saw them. They made no sound as they moved through the underbrush. I can't explain it. We were right on their heels. Then they were just gone. Was there anything else that you noticed? I asked. Anything at all? The first man stepped forward and sat a small tuft of fur on the table. This was all we could find. It was snagged on a tree. The fur was short and dark gray. I picked it up and held it beneath my nose. I'll be damned, I said softly. There really is no scent. Gabe held his hand out, and I placed the fur in his palm. He didn't look at me. He'd been avoiding my eye for days. I couldn't think of anything I'd done that would make him angry. He'd been cold toward Estelle as well. It was all very concerning. It felt like he was shutting everyone out. After a moment of examining the fur, Gabe dropped it onto the table, go back to the day patrol, and tell them that no one passes the border, no one in or out. And if anyone tries to argue, you come get me immediately. Understood? Yes, Alpha, they said in unison. They hurried out of the room. I envied them a little. I didn't want to be around Gabe right now either. When the door closed, Gabe slammed his palm into the table. What is going on around here? Yeah, he demanded. He let out an exasperated breath and ran both hands through his hair. I have to see Ed Buena. I grimaced. Gabe's mood was bad enough already. Meeting with the priestess was only going to make it worse. I didn't know exactly what caused the tension between them, but the entire pack knew that they didn't get along. Check, is there anything I can do? Gabe looked at me. The expression on his face was unreadable. It sent a shiver through me. I felt like I was looking at a stranger. Just stay here, he said. I'll be back soon. He stormed out of the room and left me sitting in awkward silence. I rubbed the bridge of my nose in an attempt to stave off a headache. I had a lot on my mind. Gabe was on edge, and it seemed like it wouldn't take much to push him into a violent rage. With diplomatic negotiations underway and a traitor lurking in the village, having Gabe so distracted and withdrawn put us all at risk. I tried to shake the concerns from my mind. All I could do was keep looking for answers, and digging into Estelle's past seemed like a good place to start. The Radcliffe twins had seen her in their vision, so there must be something about her that we didn't know. Estelle was already in the library when I arrived. She was sitting at the table with a stack of papers and records in front of her. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark bags under her eyes. She looked up when I entered and forced a smile onto her face. She pushed a coffee mug toward me and pointed to a pot of coffee nearby. I've got a fresh pot, she said, and I sorted through the records and pulled out everything related to the Bear Lake pack. How long have you been in here? I asked. She looked absolutely exhausted, and I couldn't help but feel concerned. She frowned and looked back at the papers in front of her. I'm not really sure. I couldn't sleep last night. You've been here since last night? I asked, dumbfounded. Early this morning, I think, she said dismissively. I figured I'd just get an early start here. I'm anxious to find out more. I understand that, I said. I walked to the table and looked at the files stacked beside her. But there's no reason to stress about it. Her smile faltered, and she hid her eyes behind her hand. She took a deep breath, then looked up at me. She was clearly distraught. Gabe isn't coming to bed anymore. I just shook her head and cleared her throat. I couldn't be up there alone last night. I sighed and sat beside her. I'm sorry. I wish I knew what was going on. It's my fault, she said quietly. She bit her lip for a moment before continuing. He asked me to be his Luna, and I froze up. I didn't answer. I got overwhelmed, and tears were gathering in her eyes, and her lip was beginning to quiver. It's all right, I said softly. If that's what it is, then it'll pass. His pride is just hurt. She rubbed her eyes but didn't look at me. What do you mean? She asked. What else could he be upset about? A lot of things, I said. Gabe seemed angry with me too, which couldn't be related to Estelle. He's overworked. She nodded a little. We all are. She was right about that. I grabbed a book from the pile in front of me and flipped it open. Are you having any luck? I didn't mean to be dismissive of her, but I wasn't in any position to be helpful right now. My own exhaustion was evident, and I was desperate to get home to Lucky tonight. As much as I wanted to help, I didn't want to be here all night. Not yet, she said. I just pulled the files that were clearly marked Bear Lake, so I might not have them all. It's more than enough to start with, I said. Estelle just nodded and went back to the file in front of her. We read in silence for several hours. My eyes were burning, and the coffee was doing more to raise my heart rate than keep me awake. At this point, The hard chairs at the table were getting uncomfortable, so we moved to the couch. It helped, but not much. I closed the file I had just finished checking and rubbed my eyes. Suddenly, Estelle gasped when I looked at her. She was holding an open book toward me. I took it and glanced at the page. At the top of it was a family crest featuring a crescent moon pointing upward with a starflower in the center. It took a moment for what I was reading to process. The name Brand appeared several times in the tree, but that wasn't what stuck out. I knew one of the names on this tree. Sterling Merrick, the last alpha of the Bear Lake Pack. His wife Stella was from the Brand family, but more startling than that was the name listed for Stella's mother, Estelle Brand. Stella pulled a locket from beneath her shirt and unclasped it. She handed it to me. I took it gingerly and looked at it closely. The front had a delicately painted starflower design. I flipped it over to find her name engraved in the gold on the back. I was found with this, she explained. That's why they named me Estelle. That can't be a coincidence, I said. I was shocked, but it seemed like this was proof. I looked at the dates on the entries. You're 18, I said. The timeline works out. I think that you're the daughter of the last Alpha and Luna of Bear Lake. And Estelle looked equally stunned. She slowly took her necklace back and ran her finger over the engraving. The Alpha and Luna of the pack that attacked you, that killed. Well, she put her hand over her mouth and shook her head. Don't do that, I said quickly. You had nothing to do with that. Her eyes were watery, but she did her best to calm herself. What does this mean? That you were right? Whoever left you those flowers is probably a relative. And the rumors about the Bear Lake Pack still being around are very likely true. How that relates to anything else that's going on, I can't say. If I'm being honest, I don't have the wherewithal to figure it out tonight. She shook her head. No, neither do I. I need time for this to sink in. She put her necklace on and tucked it into her shirt. I know my parents' names, she whispered to herself. We sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then Estelle laughed. I know my name, she said. I didn't think I'd ever know where I came from. I can't imagine how that must feel. I said, the idea of never knowing my parents was only half as upsetting as the idea of never getting to know my child. The thought made me incredibly sad for her parents. Despite everything, she was surrendered, which means that they gave her up somewhere safe. They must have hoped she would have a better life far away from the horrors that were befalling the packs at that time. A newborn child of the Bear Lake Alpha would have been a target. I can't imagine giving up my baby. Estella gave me a funny look. I hadn't meant to say it out loud, and my tone must have given something away. You sound genuinely upset by that thought. I am. You don't have kids, do you? Estelle looked suspicious, and I couldn't help but react. I could feel myself smiling like a fool. I rubbed the back of my neck nervously. We hadn't actually shared this news with anyone yet, but I was too excited not to tell her. Lucky is pregnant. Estelle let out an excited cry, then covered her mouth with both hands. That's so exciting, she squealed. Oh. I mean, it's exciting, right? I couldn't help but laugh at her reaction. It's very exciting, I assured her. Congratulations, she cried. She threw her arms around me, and I returned her enthusiastic hug. Oh, Lucky must be so happy. How long have you known? Well, The library door flew open and banged against the wall, startled. I looked up to find Gabe snarling at us. He stepped into the room, and the look in his eyes raised every alarm in my mind. I stood slowly and stepped in front of Estelle. This only seemed to make him angrier. He growled menacingly at me. Get away from my mate. Chapter 33. I love you, Estelle. When the door banged open, I jumped and nearly headbutted Val. I looked over his shoulder and saw Gabe in the doorway. The look on his face sent a shiver through me. He looked livid. His eyes were wide and his teeth were bared as he stared at us.
Everything about him felt dangerous right now. His eyes were glowing as he walked into the room. Val stood slowly and stepped in front of me. "Get away from my mate," Gabe growled threateningly.
I stood and tried to move around Val, but he put his arm out to stop me. "Stay back," he said quietly.
"Don't touch her," Gabe yelled. "Gabe, you need to calm down," Val said evenly.
I stood uncertainly behind Val. I didn't know what was wrong with Gabe, but I wanted to help. At the same time, I didn't know what he might do. I'd never seen him look so angry, and I didn't know what it was about. "Calm down," he sneered at Val. I didn't want to believe it was true, but then I found you like this. Believe what I asked. I stepped around Val, but I stayed close to him. "What are you talking about?" Gabe's fists were clenched at his sides, and I could see that he was struggling to hold himself back, that either of you would betray me. I looked at Val's carefully neutral expression and the tension in his posture. I looked back at the barely restrained rage in Gabe's eyes. It clicked. Gabe thought I was cheating on him with Val. My jaw dropped open in shock. How could he think something like that? How could he think that either of us would do that to him?
"Gabe, that's not what's happening," Val said sternly. "You know that I would never quit." No, he cut Val off. "I thought that I could trust you. When I was told, I didn't believe it."
"But your scent is all over her." His voice took on an odd quality, and he stepped closer to us. "And the two of you have been shut up in here alone together for days with no progress. Now I find her in your arms," he said.
I said, "Gabe, I quit."
Gabe sprang forward, threw a punch at Val. Val dodged out of the way and jumped back, putting distance between them.
He looked completely stupefied by what was happening. I couldn't believe it either.
Gabe was attacking Val because he thought we were having an affair. It was surreal. It was completely ridiculous. It pissed me off. "Coward," Gabe growled. He lashed out again, and Val dodged, but it was closer this time. "I'm not going to fight you," Val said calmly.
"You don't have a choice," Gabe replied.
"Gabe, stop," I yelled. "This is crazy." "Don't you dare try to protect him," he said. He pointed an accusatory finger at me. "Don't you fucking dare. Estelle, don't get involved," Val said urgently. He was clearly distressed by what was happening. I felt awful. I hadn't done anything wrong, but they were still fighting because of me. Gabe turned his full attention back to Val and snarled at him. Val put his hands up with his palms facing Gabe. "I'm not fighting my alpha," he said firmly. "Then you're a coward and a traitor," Gabe yelled. Val was clearly upset by the words, but he stood his ground. "I'm neither," he said. Gabe lurched forward and got a hold of Val's shirt. He pulled him down. Val braced himself, but didn't try to pull away. The malice in Gabe's face was heart-stopping. I didn't know what he was going to do. "You absolute idiot," I screamed. Val stared at me in horror, and Gabe turned toward me and fixed me to the spot with the intensity of his stare. "How dare you?" Gabe released Val's shirt and stalked toward me. "How dare I?" he said quietly. "Putting aside that Val is the most selfless, loyal person I know, you must be an idiot if you think I could possibly be interested in anyone else." I squared my shoulders and glared back at him. Gabe laughed, and the sound was like a knife in my heart. "I caught you in the act," he shouted. "You are the only person that I have ever been with," I said indignantly. Gabe's stare was icy, and he took a step towards me. "I didn't move away. Who told you that I was cheating on you?" I demanded. "I knew who it was. It could only be Isolde who lied to you." He stopped for a second, but shook his head. "I thought it was a lie. I wanted it to be a lie. And it is so." "How can I believe you?" Because I could feel the tension building in me. "Because I love you," I yelled. And the room went still as Gabe stared at me, and the rage melted out of his expression. "You rejected me," Gabe said softly. I froze. "I saw you," Gabe said. "You saw me congratulating him," I said as calmly as I could. Congratulating, he was caught off guard and looked to Val for confirmation. "Yes," Val said. He cautiously stepped toward us. "Lucky is pregnant." Gabe blinked rapidly and his face was overcome by confusion. She, as Val, just nodded. Gabe looked lost. I'd never seen him like this, as gently as I could. I said I was excited for them, so I hugged him. Gabe was clearly conflicted. His jaw tensed, and he looked away from both of us. "Lucky is pregnant. You wouldn't hurt Lucky like this." "I wouldn't hurt you like this, either," Val said firmly. He stayed close enough to intervene if Gabe became violent again, but it was clear that whatever rage had overwhelmed him was receding. I know Gabe was clenching and unclenching his fist. I know that he looked at me and a sadness entered his eyes that broke my heart. "I thought you rejected me for him." "I didn't reject you," I said. "I asked you to be my Luna and you..." I froze. I repeated, "Gabe, I wasn't expecting the question and I got scared. Becoming the Luna is a lot of responsibility that I don't feel ready for." I reached for him and he stepped back, not letting me touch him. It stung. "You love me?" he asked softly. "Yes, you idiot," I said in irritation. I thought that was pretty obvious. Gabe's shoulders relaxed and he looked at Val with a helpless expression. "I'm sorry," he said. "What the hell caused that?" Val demanded. I said angrily. They both turned and looked at me in surprise. "Isolde told you that I was sleeping with Val, didn't she?" "She said that she walked in on the two of you in here," Gabe said. "How did you know?" I ground my teeth and clenched my fist. "I know because that psycho is the one that's been spreading rumors about me." Val said in surprise. "She's the source of the rumor. I should have told you both from the beginning, but I didn't think you'd believe me," I said. "Since my first day here, she's been telling me to leave. She keeps saying that I don't belong here. She's starting rumors to turn the pack against me and run me out of town." I was the one fighting down my rage now. I couldn't believe that she would tell Gabe such a horrible thing. Did she really want to hurt me so badly that she didn't care if Gabe was hurt too? "Why would she do that?" Gabe asked. He looked uncertain. "She wants to be your Luna," I said. The expression on Gabe's face was almost comical. It was a combination of disgust and anger. "Isolde as my Luna." "That makes sense," Val scoffed. Gabe looked at him. Whatever emotional battle he'd just fought had left him raw. I'd never seen such unguarded expressions on his face. He looked utterly confused. "She's always following you around and staring at you like a moonstruck teenager. She's always volunteering to take on duties that would normally be the Luna." "I'm going to do far worse than break her nose," I said angrily. "I can't believe you would listen to something so ludicrous." I didn't. At first I called her a liar, but Gabe looked embarrassed. "It's insidious," Val said. "Jealousy can make you crazy." He put his hand on Gabe's shoulder and squeezed firmly. "I'm sorry," Gabe said again. "Val, you know me better than that." Val finished for him. "I'm not going to lie. I'm pissed at you." He rubbed his temple and sighed, "But I just want to get home to Lucky. You two clearly have a lot to talk about." Go, Gabe said, "and spend tomorrow with Lucky. I'll find some way to make this up to you." "Just deal with Isolde," Val spat angrily. "You don't have to worry about that," Gabe replied coldly. Val patted Gabe's shoulder, then looked at me. "I'll tell Lucky you're happy for us." "I'm thrilled for you," I said. Val smiled and waved before heading for the door. It was awkward being alone with Gabe. He looked mortified by what had just happened. He shook his head in disbelief and looked at me. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "The thought of you together just made me crazy. I tried to put it out of my head." But "I forgive you," I said. "I probably would have gone a little crazy too." I sighed and rubbed my eyes. You look tired, he said. I didn't sleep last night. I admitted I just couldn't relax without you. Is this why you haven't been coming to bed? He looked guilty. I couldn't stand smelling Val's scent on you. Well, we won't be pulling all-nighters in the library anymore. I said, we figured it out. You did, Gabe asked in shock. What do you mean by figured it out? We're pretty certain we figured out who my parents were. It was a strange sentence to speak, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. I was mortified by the truth. My parents were responsible for Gabe losing his. I wished I could keep the information to myself, but I couldn't. He asked. Stella and Sterling Merrick, I said quietly. Gabe's eyes went wide as he stared at me. The Alpha and Luna of Bear Lake, he said. You're an Alpha's daughter. Apparently, I said uncertainly. I took my necklace off and handed it to him. He took it and carefully examined it. This is why I wanted to get my things back. This necklace is the only thing I have from my parents. A starflower, he said, from their family crest. He flipped it over and stared at my name. Apparently, I'm named after my grandmother. I said, I took a shaky breath, Gabe. I quit. I'm glad you found out the truth, he said. Now we just need to find out what happened to them. How did you end up in the human world? The truth was that my parents betrayed him. I didn't understand why he wasn't angry about this. He held the necklace up to me and I nodded. He put the chain around my neck and fastened it. Stella, he said uncertainly. I looked up at him, and despite my irritation at how he just behaved, the affection in his eyes took my breath away. Yeah, I asked. He wrapped his arms around me and kissed me gently before pulling away. His gaze was soft and full of adoration. I love you too. Chapter 34. The road. Gabe followed me up the stairs toward our bedroom. We were both exhausted physically and emotionally. I was angry that he would doubt me, but I understood it. If I thought that he was interested in someone else, it would hurt. Besides, Isolde was good at getting under people's skin. She seemed to be able to tell what a person was most insecure about and use it against them. She'd done it to me, and I'd broken her nose. The fact that Gabe felt insecure about our relationship bothered me. Looking at him, you would never guess that he could feel insecure about anything. Gabe was stunning to look at, and his deep voice was practically hypnotic. He effortlessly commanded every room he entered. He was intelligent and charismatic. Insecure was the last word I'd use to describe him. From what I'd learned of Gabe's childhood, expressing his emotions wasn't exactly encouraged. There was no way to know how much he'd been hiding. His face wasn't guarded now. He looked miserable and guilty. We reached the top of the stairs and I stopped. He waited, growing more nervous the longer we stood there. Seeing his face so open and unguarded melted whatever residual anger I felt toward him. How could he think that I wanted anyone else? I stood on my toes and kissed him. I could feel the tension in his muscles ease as he wrapped his arms around me. Idiot, I muttered. How could you doubt me like that? I'm sorry, he said softly. He started to move away from me, but I tangled my fingers in his dark hair and pulled him into another kiss. He gasped a little and returned the kiss. I nipped his lip as I pulled back. His eyes darkened as he looked down at me, but he didn't make a move. I smirked as an idea occurred to me. I just have to show him how much I wanted him. I think you'd better make it up to me, I said softly. Gabe looked confused but nodded. How can I? I'll think of something, I said. I took Gabe's hand and led him into our room, shutting the door behind us. I could tell that he was hesitant as I led him to the bed. I pushed him to sit on the mattress, and he did so before looking up at me for some kind of explanation. I guess I haven't done enough to show you how I feel, I said quietly. I was a little embarrassed, but I knew what I wanted. I forced my nerves aside and tried to keep my voice steady. I'll have to fix that. I pushed Gabe back on the bed and straddled his hips. He stared at me in wide-eyed disbelief as I pulled his shirt over his head. Stella, you don't have to. I know I said. I tossed his shirt aside and kissed him. I've missed you. His expression shifted between shame and confusion. I sat back and pulled my dress over my head. I let it drop to the floor and took his wrists. I pinned his arms to his sides and kissed his neck. He moaned softly and tilted his head back. Maybe it was because we hadn't slept together in a few days. Or maybe it was because of the emotional high of the past hour. But it gave me a thrill to pull these pleasured sounds from him. I've never seen you so angry, I said as I bit gently at his shoulder. Gabe groaned and shifted under me, but he didn't try to free his hands like I'd expected him to. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I love that you're willing to apologize, I said, but that's not my point. I bit his earlobe and whispered into his ear. Does the thought of someone else touching me really make you that crazy? He shuddered, and I could feel the rumble of his voice against me as he growled softly. Yeah. I bit gently at his throat, and he inhaled sharply. You are the only one I've been with, I said. You know that. I know, he said softly. I released his wrists, and he immediately grabbed my waist and sat up, holding me on his lap. I tangled my fingers in his hair and sat back, looking into his eyes. You're the only one I ever planned to be with, I said seriously. He ran his hands up my sides. He was listening to me raptly, giving me his full attention. It sent a thrill through me having him focused solely on me. It was rare that his mind wasn't on some other pressing matter. If you ever accuse me of anything like that again, I'm going to break your nose. He laughed and buried his face in my shoulder to hide it. I couldn't help but laugh too. The tension between us was too much for me, and Gabe's laughter was depressingly rare. I ran my fingers through his hair and held him. I was still annoyed that he could doubt me like that, and his display of anger had been shocking, but he'd been doing his best to control himself. I could tell that much. His anger problem was something we could work on. I pulled on his hair lightly until he lifted his head and looked at me. I promised to come to you when something was wrong, and I didn't. I'm sorry, I said. You really thought that I wouldn't believe you about Estelle? He asked. You've known her your entire life. I ran my fingers through his hair, paying special attention to the streak of white near his ear. Why should I expect you to trust me more than her? Because I love you, he said softly. I kissed him quickly. I'll keep my promise from now on, I said. If you'll promise to do the same. Talk to me if something is bothering you. Don't build up crazy scenarios in your head. Deal, he said. Good, I said. I pushed him back onto the mattress. We talked about it. He looked up at me, confused, but when I started to pull at his pants, he lifted his hips so that I could move them away. Now I'm going to show you exactly how much I want you. I pinned him back to the bed when he tried to sit up. Be a good boy, I said sternly, and do what I tell you. It was hard to tell in the dark, but it seemed like his face colored slightly. He stared at me mutely. If I hesitated anymore, I was going to lose my nerve. I straddled his hips and bent to kiss his throat again. He moaned and grabbed my hips without removing my mouth from his skin. I grabbed his hands and pinned them beside his head. His breathy moan confirmed it. He liked it when I took control. You're mine too, I said breathlessly. Even in the dark, I could see his eyes darken. I kept his wrists pinned as I lowered myself onto him. He watched my face intently, and I tried to keep my eyes on him, although my face was burning with embarrassment. It was worth it to see the way he looked at me. Don't move, I ordered. Gabe growled softly, but he stayed still as I released his wrists and sat back for a better angle. I rotated my hips experimentally and gasped at the feeling. I adjusted my legs and repeated the motion, making Gabe moan with me. I grinned at him, and he let out a frustrated groan and threw his head back, closing his eyes and twisting his hands in the bedsheet. Estelle, he said, his voice was gravelly and strained, and I loved it. Let me move. Not yet, I said. Knowing that I was affecting him so much was incredible. I started moving slowly, but built my pace quickly. I couldn't keep quiet. Gabe wasn't managing any better. I focused on Gabe's reactions, trying to keep myself from losing control too soon. I wanted to show him what he did to me every time. I could see his stomach muscles constricting as he arched under me. My legs were starting to shake. I fell forward and bit his neck, causing him to cry out in pleasure. He still didn't move, and the power I had over him was sending me hurtling toward a climax. I nuzzled his neck, and he shuddered. Touch me, I gasped out. Gabe's hands sparked arousal on my oversensitive skin as he ran his fingers up my thighs, down my ribs, and anywhere else he could reach. He slammed upwards and cursed under his breath. I dug my nails into his shoulders and did my best to match his movements. Gabe rolled us and pinned me beneath him. I wrapped my legs around him and growled. He cursed and kissed my throat, muttering into my skin. I couldn't hear him. I was gasping and moaning too much to make out his words. I could feel his words vibrating against my skin. He kissed my shoulder and held my hips, still as he slammed against me. I moaned as his teeth dug in and just barely pierced my skin. The pain was present, but the pleasure overwhelmed it as I started to tremble with my release. He pulled away suddenly and threw his head back. For several moments, we both panted in the dark. Gabe lay beside me and pulled me into his arms. He gently touched my shoulder and grimaced. It's fine, I said dismissively. Gabe shook his head. No, he said, you don't understand. I frowned and cuddled closer to him. Explain it, then. It's the mate mark. He said he ran his fingers around the shallow puncture wounds, a scar that shows you've been claimed. I almost did it without asking. I hummed thoughtfully. That does sound like something you should ask about first. I'm glad you didn't do it, I said thoughtfully, but I might be just a little flattered. You're so strange, he muttered. He kissed me and pulled me against his chest. That's rich coming from you. I teased. I kissed Gabe's shoulder experimentally. Would I bite you too? If you wanted to mark me, he said softly. I did. I wanted Isolde and anyone else who looked at Gabe longingly to know that he was spoken for. I nipped the spot and he shuddered and kissed the side of my head. We should get some sleep. I hummed in my agreement, but neither of us moved away from the other. A comfortable silence fell over us. I ran my fingers along Gabe's collar and relished the slight shivers that it drew from him. The relief of having him in my arms again was hard to overstate. The sound of someone running up the stairs broke the silence. Gabe got up and quickly pulled his pants on. He looked at me in concern, and I pulled the blanket over myself and shrugged. I had no idea who would be rushing to our door at this hour. Gabe sniffed the air and frowned in further confusion. It's Val, he said. The door burst open, and sure enough, a panting, half-dressed Val was revealed. We have to get to the border, he said frantically. They've caught the rogue. Chapter 35, Dealing with Isolde. Gabe. Val leaned heavily on the door frame and breathed heavily. His shirt was hanging open, and his shoes were untied, making it clear that he was pulled out of bed. We have to get to the border, he said frantically. They've caught the rogue. I looked at Estelle, but she was already waving me out. Go get the bastard, she said. Val nodded enthusiastically. They're holding him at the checkpoint, he explained. I'm right behind you, I said. I grabbed my shirt from the floor and slipped my shoes on before following Val down the stairs. He hurried out the door as soon as he knew I was following. The moment we were out, we both broke into a run. Val was ahead of me, as he always was. This wasn't even full speed for him. We wove around the trees as we ran. My heart was hammering from the adrenaline coursing through me. I couldn't detect any unfamiliar scents, but I could tell that a large number of people were gathered nearby. We reached the checkpoint and found the guards surrounding a man with shaggy brown hair. I recognized him immediately. He was the man that attacked Estelle the night I met her. The guards parted to let Val and me through. The man looked at me, but there was no fear in his eyes. He looked almost resigned. I couldn't smell him. I didn't understand how that was possible. "Finally caught you," I said. There was recognition in his eyes, but he didn't speak. I grabbed him by his collar and lifted him from his feet. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded. He remained silent and simply stared at me. I lowered him to the ground and looked him over. His hair was overgrown and scruffy, and he had the beginnings of a beard growing in. His clothes were mud-stained and wrinkled. He'd been living in the forest. I couldn't say for how long. I didn't take my eyes from him, but I addressed the guards. "What was he doing?" "Lurking," a voice responded. "He was pacing around nearby like he was waiting for something." "Waiting on our traitor," I said angrily. His eyes widened just a fraction, but it was enough of a reaction to confirm that I was right. "What kind of deal do you have with them? What are you trying to accomplish?" A calculating look entered his eye, and he looked around at the crowd. He knew that he wasn't going to get out of this. He seemed to come to a decision after scanning those assembled. "Kill the red-headed woman," he said. I growled and released him to keep myself from hurting him, yet I know that. "What?" He shrugged nonchalantly. I was paid to. The casual attitude toward Estelle's life enraged me. I could feel the guards around us shrinking back. I clenched my fists at my side. "By who?" I gritted out. "That I won't tell you," he said simply. I punched him. His head flipped back with the speed and force of the blow. When he lifted his head again, his lip was split and bleeding. He shook his head as if to clear it, then looked at me again. His gaze was steady and unrelenting. There was no determination in his face. He just stared blankly at me. It was maddening. "You will tell me," I said slowly, "whether by your own volition or by other means." I seized the front of his shirt again and pushed him backward until I could slam him into a tree. The guards scattered to make way for us. I could hear Val quietly talking to the guards. He was telling them to keep their guard up, but stay back and stay quiet. "Good. Do you know who I am?" I asked. That set off a whisper among the men. I wanted to dismiss them, but they had captured this man. They had a right to see what happened next. "Gabriel Malone, the avenging angel alpha of the Eagle's Nest pack," he recited. His tone wasn't dismissive, just detached. "Do you know who the red-headed woman is?" I demanded. If he knew who I was, then he was a fool for continuing to pursue Estelle. He must have known what I would do when I caught him. "Your mate," he answered. "Then you have a death wish." I gripped his throat, but didn't apply pressure. He gave a non-committal hum in response. The image of Estelle dangling from his grasp flashed through my mind, and I growled. "I should have killed you back in the city." "You should have," he said. His voice was gravelly and emotionless. "I'll remedy that mistake," I replied. I brought my free hand back to strike him, but Val grabbed my elbow. "We can't get anything from him if he's dead," Val said sternly. "You won't get anything either way," the rogue said. I stared at him, trying to check my anger. His vicious attack on Estelle was flashing through my mind. I could feel my hand shaking with my anger. Val was right. As I looked at the detached, almost unfocused expression on the man's face, I realized something. He didn't care if he died. Violence and anger wouldn't get me anywhere with him. This man was here to keep his side of an agreement. He didn't seem to care one way or the other how it turned out. What kind of hold did our traitor have on him that could motivate a man to such lengths? My hand tightened on his throat, but he made no attempt to break my grip. Gabriel said quietly, "We may be able to use him to flush out the traitor." The man looked at Val and raised an eyebrow. "It's worth a try," I said. I pulled him forward and shoved him toward the assembled guards. He skidded on the ground and didn't attempt to stand when he stopped. We didn't have a jail, so the best place that I could have him held was the temple basement. It was windowless, and the only entrance would be easy to guard. It was dank, cold, and miserable, the perfect prison. Edwina was going to hate that. "Take him to the temple," I ordered. "Tell Edwina to lock him in the basement." When they were out of sight, I rubbed my temples and sighed. "What are we going to do about this?" I asked. "Hell if I know," Val said. "I'm barely awake." "I'm sorry you were dragged away from Lucky again," I said sincerely. I really did want to give him time off. I couldn't imagine how crazy I would feel being away from my pregnant mate. She understands there's a lot to be dealt with. Val was trying to mask the emotion in his voice, but I could hear it clearly. He was feeling guilty. We started walking back toward the village. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were coming to a head. There were too many things up in the air, and eventually they would have to fall. I was afraid of the damage that would be done when it happened. "It shouldn't be your burden," I said. "Go home, I can handle things for today. The rogue won't break so soon. A day or so in that dank basement will be a good starting point. It won't take long for the word to get out that he's there. Whoever our traitor is, they may tip their hand." "Do you think they'll panic?" Val asked thoughtfully. "It's a possibility. They'll know that there's a chance he'll turn on them. We'll need to keep an eye out for strange behavior and guard that rogue. Well, were I in our traitor's position, I'd try to kill him before he could talk. Whoever the traitor is, they must have had some notion of what I was going to do to them when I get my hands on them." Continued attempts to reach Estelle were unforgivable, but I was equally outraged by the injuries sustained by my guard and the potential risk the entire pack had been under since this man started attempting to cross our border. This was an unforgivable betrayal. Val shook his head. "I can't believe that someone would do this. What motive could they possibly have?" I had no idea what could motivate a member of the pack to want Estelle dead. Maybe someone knew about her parentage, and this was some twisted attempt at revenge against Bear Lake. There was no way to know. I'm more disturbed that they knew Estelle was there before I did. I confessed this rogue had attacked Estelle before I'd even reached her. How had her movements been monitored so closely? Val looked shocked. "It never occurred to me," he said softly. "But you're right. How could that be?" "I don't know. I said it had been bothering me for months." I tried to dismiss the idea, but confirming that this rogue is the same one that attacked Estelle all those months ago made it clear. Whoever this traitor was, they knew Estelle was coming and tried to kill her before I could get to her. How long had they been following her? How had they found her? "No wonder you've been stressed," Val said. He puffed a breath and ran his fingers through his hair. "What the hell is going on around here?" "I'm going to find out," I said, "but not today. Go home, be with Lucky. We'll deal with this later. In the meantime, I'm going to have to make a decision about Isolde." "What are you thinking?" Val asked. He was rightfully angry. Isolde had slandered his name in her attempt to sabotage Estelle. The fact that she would consider Val nothing more than collateral damage hadn't occurred to me until this moment, and it renewed my rage over the entire situation.
I'd be hard-pressed to show her mercy after what she did, putting aside the insult of lying directly to my face to denigrate my beta and my mate the way she did. I had to stop. The anger was threatening to overtake my better judgment.
Charles is going to be pissed either way. Val said with derision it was far from the first time he'd spit the man's name like a curse.
I don't care, I answered.
Val looked surprised. I was beginning to think that I may be too close to Charles to see him for what he is. Edwina had warned me about him for years, and Val didn't trust him. Estelle said that he made her uncomfortable. Maybe they were right. And it was time I stopped seeking his guidance. I couldn't pinpoint the moment I'd lost control of the pack, but I wasn't going to allow it to continue. I was going to take back my pack. And the first step was dealing with Heisel. Chapter 36. Strip Gabe. The adrenaline of the encounter with the rogue was wearing off by the time I reached home. I was exhausted, but there was too much to be done for me to sleep. Estelle apparently felt the same sense of immediacy because she was waiting for me just inside the door. She looked relieved to see me.
What happened? She asked anxiously.
It was the same rogue that attacked you.
I confirmed.
She looked upset, but not surprised. I pulled her into my arms and kissed the top of her head. We were alone, and I wanted the comfort of holding her just as much as she wanted to be held. She wrapped her arms around me and sighed heavily. I'm glad he was caught, but it's terrifying to think that he's been trying to get to me this entire time. I had to wonder how much this had been weighing on her mind. So much had happened in the past few months. It was hard to even keep track. We can't lower our guard. I said, we don't know if he's the only one. I didn't want to add to her fear, but she needed to know that the risk hadn't passed. I know, she said softly. What happened to him? She pulled away from my arms and I let her go reluctantly. Her expression was hard to read, which was rare for her. He's being held in the temple, I said. She nodded thoughtfully at that. If she told me she wanted him dead, I'd kill him in an instant. She wouldn't. I knew that she was too compassionate to want revenge the way I did. I took her hand and led her toward the kitchen. If we weren't gonna sleep, we at least needed to eat. She was contemplative as we ate, and I didn't try to force her into conversation. I had plenty on my mind, too. I had to make a decision about Isolde. I wanted to banish her. The more I thought about her actions, the angrier I became. She was in a position of privilege within the pack, and she'd used it to manipulate me. I was disappointed in myself for being taken in by her lies, but I was disgusted with the lengths she was willing to go to. If Estelle was right about her motivation, it was even more insidious. She was not my mate, so why would she try to become my Luna? Estelle touched my arm and I looked up at her. I had no idea how long I'd been sitting in thought. She'd finished her food and mine had gone cold. What's on your mind? She asked. I have to decide what to do about Isolde, I answered. There's no easy solution for this. If she weren't the child of an elder, what would you do? She stood and took her plate to the sink. I poked at my cold food and scowled. Banish her for conspiring against me. I said I could hear the angry edge to my voice and tried to rein it back in. I needed a cool head to make the right decision. That sounds a little extreme, Estelle said softly. Many in the pack would probably agree with her. The risk of Estelle being blamed for my reaction was too high, but there had to be a punishment. I'm conflicted, I admitted. That's understandable, Estelle said. She leaned over the back of the chair and wrapped her arms around me. It's a difficult decision. I'm sorry that you're in this position. Even if this weren't so personal, it would be my responsibility to address it. Isolde had caused unrest and even violence within the pack. Her actions couldn't go unpunished. Estelle made a thoughtful sound. What if you just kind of demote her? What do you mean? I leaned my head back against her shoulder.
Like take away her position and restrict her privileges. She'll still be part of the pack, but she won't have the influence that she used to manipulate people. It sounded like a good compromise. A hide soul would be mortified by the public nature of such a change, and hurting her pride was the best punishment I could pursue without violence. Charles would be infuriated, but as I told Val, I didn't care anymore. Estelle was the biggest victim of Isolde's machinations. If that was a good enough solution for her, then why would I argue? All right, I said quietly, you're the future Luna. If that's the solution you think is best, then that's what we'll do. You still want me to be your Luna? She asked softly. She stood and stepped back, allowing me to stand. I pulled her into my arms and kissed her. Of course I do. I said, why would she think that I'd changed my mind? She averted her eyes. So how do you approach this? She asked. A public announcement. I said, I would have to talk to the officials at the school privately to clarify things, but a general announcement would be necessary to ensure that the pack knew Isolde was no longer authorized to act on my behalf. It had been a mistake to allow her to take such a prominent role in the first place. She had volunteered so consistently that eventually it was just expected that she would handle family concerns and intervention with the pup. I was no good at those things, and I needed Val's help with too many other obligations to ask him to take that on. There was always too much to do. Maybe that's why she was able to get away with these games for so long. My attention was pulled in too many directions. She'd been able to operate under the radar because I'd been too busy to notice her. How can I help? Estelle asked. I hesitated to involve her, but she had a right to be included in this. I was going to have to get accustomed to sharing some of these duties with her. I wanted her to be my Luna. Her insight and mercy in this issue only drove home that fact. Will you talk to Val for me? I said, let him know that this announcement is coming. I don't want to blindside him. All right, she said. She kissed me, then went to the door. I'll be back soon, she promised. I waited until I heard the front door close, then went upstairs to shower and get dressed. The hot water helped to clear my head. Estelle's instincts were sharp. If this was the move she thought was best, then it probably was. It wouldn't satisfy my anger, but I had to stop letting that lead me. It had served me well when the pack was in danger, and I was fighting each day for our survival. That wasn't the case anymore. If I wanted the pack to be secure, I needed to start ruling from a position of security. The problem was that I'd never known security in my life. I wasn't confident in my ability to navigate this new world I'd built for us. Once I was showered, I sent word through a courier that an announcement would be made in the town square within the hour. I considered finding Charles and discussing the issue with him first, but it wouldn't make a difference. He would try to talk me out of this course of action, but my mind was made up. It had been a long time since I'd been so nervous about addressing the pack. Isolde was popular. People would be upset by this. The more I thought about it, the more Estelle's compromise seemed like the right call. It wasn't long before people started to gather in the square. There was uneasy conversation and activity as I waited for the crowd to reach a sufficient size. I could see Isolde whispering with some of the young women, and it took all of my self-control not to take action. When Val and Estelle approached me, I prepared to speak with Estelle standing to my left and Val to my right. I called the crowd to attention. I'll make this quick, I said. I scanned the crowd and took in the nervous gazes. I hated this part of my role. I must address a series of incidents that have impacted our pack over the past several months. You are already aware of the unrest and rumors that have settled over our community. I have discovered the person responsible. A wave of chatter passed through the crowd. and I waited for it to pass.
Isolde keened, I said steadily. Her face fell in shock, and the people standing near her turned to stare.
You have lied to me. You have lied to this pack, and you have used your lies to cause harm to my mate and my beta.
You have sought to manipulate me to gain greater power and influence for yourself. I will not tolerate such behavior from anyone. It is only because of your history of service to the pack that you will be shown any mercy.
Her eyes were watery, and there was no mistaking the fear that had seized her. Yet she made no attempt to deny my word. Your deceptions have jeopardized the safety of your packmates. And for the good of the pack, you must be punished.
Charles was pushing his way toward the front of the crowd. Isolde looked resigned.
I had to respect her for that. So you are hereby stripped of all power and authority that you were once entrusted with. You will no longer enter my home without an invitation, nor speak to me without an official audience. I stared down at her, and the anger that I'd tried to keep at bay welled within me. You are hereby discharged from your rank and position. With that, I turned from her stricken face and walked from the square. Gabe Charles called from the crowd. I didn't acknowledge him, but turned to Estelle. Go on ahead. I said Charles made her uneasy. I wouldn't subject her to his anger. You too, I told Val. He looked uncertain still. He did. As I asked and moved through the crowd toward Lucky. Charles approached me, his face red with anger. You can't do this. I can do as I see fit, I said. I walked away. I didn't want this scene to be witnessed anymore than I wanted this argument overheard. He followed at my heels. Isolde has been loyal for years. She's done more than her share to care for the pack. You can't just toss her aside now. That I whirled to face him. I can do what I think is right for this pack, regardless of how you feel about it, I said. Her behavior is not innocent. Charles, she's sown unrest in the pack. She's caused violence and distrust to spread. She has lied, not only to me, but about me. I would be more than justified in banishing her for her treasonous scheme. It is only because of Estelle's mercy that she will remain in this pack. You would do well to remember that. His brown eyes darkened, and he stared at me with his jaw firmly clenched. I didn't shrink from the glare. It only angered me further. An icy feeling settled over me as I looked at him. I was a fool for letting it get to this point. It would go no further. My word is final, I said firmly. The hatred in his eyes as he looked at me made him a stranger as he stormed off. It occurred to me that I may be seeing the real Charles for the first time, and that it might not be the last of him. Chapter 37, Poison Mine. It was mid-autumn, and the evening was cold and crisp. The cool air normally helped to clear my mind, but even that wasn't enough to calm my racing thoughts today. It had been 2 days since Gabe announced his decision about Isolde. I was surprised by how lenient he was, but I had a feeling Estelle was responsible for that. Nevertheless, there was unrest in the pack about the announcement. It had been years since anyone had been ousted from their position. Isolde had her supporters, and they didn't believe that she had lied to Gabe. Isolde went out of her way to help around the community. I could see why it would be difficult to reconcile her good deeds with the harm she'd done. There was debate throughout the village. Some had overheard the argument between Charles and Gabe. As a result, many praised Estelle for choosing to show mercy. The unrest wasn't as severe as the rumors that had circulated when Estelle first arrived. I suspected that was due to Isolde's silence on the matter. She hadn't spoken a word in her own defense, which most took as an admission of guilt. Charles was livid even more than I'd expected him to be. The strength of his outrage made me suspicious. I couldn't help but wonder if Isolde had been acting on her father's orders. I saw her in the cafe yesterday. She'd been chatting with Anna, and she seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in a long time. It wouldn't surprise me at all to learn that Charles was using his daughter to advance some strange scheme. I couldn't bring myself to suggest it to Gabe, but I had to wonder if Charles could be our traitor. I had no idea what motivation he could have or how he would have known about Estelle before Gabe did. I just got an uneasy feeling when he was near. Charles had always made me feel weary, but it had gotten worse since Estelle arrived. If his goal was for Estelle to become the Luna, as Estelle suggested, then that could explain his strange behavior.
The rogue in the temple basement was another source of concern. He'd been caught at such an ungodly early hour that no one had seen him being brought into the village, and Edwina kept his presence silent. That did little to comfort me.
Maybe it was because my mate was pregnant, but I was losing sleep over the presence of a murderous rogue in the village. There was no telling what could come of his capture. I was probably overthinking, even if it was short-lived. Gabe's rage toward me had set me on edge. The fact that he could believe, even for a moment, that I would betray my mate and my alpha disturbed me. The odd occurrences in the pack must have affected him more than I'd realized. I was worried about him. I had a bad feeling, despite the fact that Gabe had given me time off to spend with Lucky. I was having trouble putting my concerns aside. I had spent a nice day with Lucky, but she was tired and had gone home early to rest. I was far too anxious to join her, so I was on my way to the main house. I had no idea what I would do when I arrived. Maybe I'd head to the library and continue digging into records about the Bear Lake pack. There were still so many things we didn't know about Estelle's family. I couldn't shake the feeling that figuring out what happened to her mother was going to be the puzzle piece that put everything into perspective. I just couldn't understand how someone could surrender their pup, especially to the human world. The sense of loss that twisted in my chest when I imagined making the same choice for my child was nearly unbearable. There must have been a reason. I entered the house and walked toward the library, but before I could reach the door, I heard raised voices. I followed the sound to the parlor. The door opened before I'd even reached it, and Gabe motioned me inside. I could tell by the look on his face that he was irritated. As soon as I entered the room, it became clear why. Charles, Giles, and Mama Ida were seated around the meeting table. The atmosphere of the room was tense and uncomfortable. Gabe pulled me aside and whispered, "I thought you were taking the day off." Lucky was tired, I explained. I thought I'd see if I could be of use while she rests. "I am glad you're here," he said. I could tell by the tension in his jaw that the elders were already trying his patience. Charles demanded a council meeting and wouldn't explain why. "I'll give you one guess," I muttered. Gabe just nodded his agreement, then went to his seat at the head of the table. I sat to his right and looked around at the assembled elders. Ida looked almost as annoyed as Gabe did. She'd normally be at her weekly game night with Estelle right now. I'm sure she was irritated at being dragged away. Giles looked uncomfortable, which wasn't altogether uncommon for him. I didn't know him especially well, but Lucky worked with him outside of healing. He was prone to bouts of nervousness and anxiety. Lucky had described him as paranoid more than once. Charles was practically vibrating with impatience. He looked at Gabe expectantly. "What's this about?" Gabe asked. Charles stood and fixed him with a glare. "Iselde's treatment has been outrageous," he said angrily. "The only thing that's outrageous is that you are trying to justify her behavior," Gab said. I knew that Gabe had been expecting a further confrontation with Charles. He'd shut the older man down directly after the announcement, but Charles was tenacious. Despite Isolde's seeming acceptance of the situation, it would be out of character for Charles to accept a decision he didn't agree with. "I don't know who has convinced you of these ridiculous lies," Charles spit, "but to condemn Isolde without even discussing the accusations with her is cruel." Gabe narrowed his eyes. "Who exactly are you calling a liar?" he asked. "Me, my mate, or my beta. Maybe idea.
and Giles were silent as he stared at Charles, waiting for his response. When Charles was silent, Gabe continued, "She lied to me in an attempt to manipulate me. Her accusation against Vol is more than enough grounds for this punishment." "It's that girl that's pushed you to this," Charles sneered. "Now that's too far." Mama Ada interjected. "Estelle is a grown woman. She chose to lie to the Alpha. You should be grateful for the mercy she's been shown." Mama Ada had grown tired of Charles's entitled behavior long ago of the three elders. She was the one least inclined to volunteer her opinion. She was happy to discuss issues with Gabe if he sought her out, but had told him more than once that she was happy to support whatever decision he came to. It was good to hear her backing up that promise. "Now, there's no proof that Estelle did anything wrong," Charles argued. "I trust the Alpha's word on the matter," Giles said, "but Estelle has been an invaluable asset for many years. It does seem harsh to oust her for her first offense." "Were the offense not so grievous, I'd agree with you," Gabe said, "but to attack the honor of my mate and my beta is reprehensible, and to do so in an attempt to manipulate me is traitorous." "She didn't intend any harm," Charles said. "She accused me of sleeping with my Alpha's mate," I said angrily. I should have stayed quiet. My job was to be there to support Gabe, but I couldn't hold my tongue. I was furious that Estelle had dragged my name through the mud in order to target Estelle. She showed no concern for the consequences of her accusation. The damage that could have been done to my relationship with Lucky didn't bear thinking about. The betrayal that Gabe felt was only a fraction of what Lucky would have experienced, especially so early in her first pregnancy. I couldn't blame Gabe for being so angry about the accusation. If the roles had been reversed, I probably would have lost my temper too. If Estelle hadn't been able to calm Gabe, who knows what could have happened. He had been ready to fight me, and I don't know that I could have stopped him. An awkward silence fell over the room, and it was clear that the nature of the lie hadn't been known. Mama Ada had a sour expression on her face, and Giles looked scandalized. "The idea that Val would betray me like that is ludicrous," Gabe said angrily, "and the insult to Estelle's honor can't go unanswered." "This is still an overreach," Charles said. It was a poor choice of words, and he seemed to realize it the moment he said it. Gabe stood and slammed his hands onto the table, leaning toward Charles threateningly. "Are you implying that I've acted beyond my authority?" he growled. "Do you need to be reminded who I am?" Giles and Mama Ada exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret. I felt an odd sense of pride seeing Gabe reasserting his position. He'd allowed Charles to push the limits of his role as an advisor for far too long. He needed a reminder that Gabe was the one responsible for the well-being of this pack. Estelle's campaign of slander against Estelle has caused undue stress and disquiet within the pack. The time that it will take for me to fully remedy the problems she's caused will distract me from other matters that demand my attention and why to hurt Estelle," he said angrily. Charles lifted his chin and met Gabe's eyes steadily. "Estelle isn't responsible for Estelle's thin skin," he said. He was a sanctimonious, self-aggrandizing old man who had grown accustomed to getting his way. He was finally taking things too far. "Watch your mouth," Gabe growled in warning. "That girl has poisoned your mind," Charles said calmly. "That woman," Gabe growled out, "will be our Luna. Your judgment has been clouded by her affection," Charles said in disgust that tipped Gabe over the edge. "I am the Alpha." His voice echoed off of the walls, and the room fell deadly still and silent. "This is my pack, and I will determine what is in their best interest." He stood and glared down at Charles. A look of icy resolve settled over his features. "You will learn your place, or you will lose it." Charles started to speak, but Gabe held his hand up for silence. He took a deep breath to rein in his anger. He cast a weary gaze around the table, settling on me. I nodded once, indicating that I would support whatever he chose to do. I trusted his leadership. Charles had clearly forgotten that the council's job was to advise Gabe, not instruct him. This council is dissolved, Gabe said firmly, permanently. Chapter 38, it's not over yet. Estelle. Things in the village were quiet for the past few days. It seemed that the initial unrest after Isolde's punishment was starting to die down. I was nervous about going out on my own for a few days after the memory of the riot at the craft fair and the painful bruise on my ribs made me weary of venturing too far from Gabe or Val. But Val had invited me to visit Lucky at their house, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity. I was so excited about her pregnancy, and I wanted to ask her a million questions. I had tried to be polite about it, but I know she'd seen how overeager I was. She was nice about the whole thing and just laughed when Val finally asked me to stop. I was embarrassed. I hadn't meant to get personal. I was just fascinated. I wasn't ready to have a baby anytime soon, but I knew that I wanted to. One day, Val had offered to walk me home, but I declined. I wanted to stop by the inn and see Mama Ida first, and I wasn't about to ask him to stand around waiting for me while we chatted. Mama Ida was concerned about how things were going up at the main house since Gabe dissolved the council. Well, maybe concerned wasn't the right word. She was curious. She told me that as an old gossip, she missed being part of the deliberations and discussions of local concerns. I'd promised to keep her in the loop as much as I could. Despite her complaints, I could tell that she was in good spirits. Gabe had arranged a visit from the Luna of the Crystal Lake Pack and a small delegation. Lucky's parents would be among them, so Mama Ida was taking special care to prepare the inn. I was excited that Lucky's parents were coming to celebrate the pregnancy with her. I knew that it had been years since she'd seen them. There was a slight chill in the air as I made my way from the inn toward home. I wished that I'd brought something warm. It would be winter soon, and I was going to need new clothes. I would have to ask Gabe where I could get some from. I rounded a corner onto a residential street not far from home. It was getting dark earlier now, and I was already losing the light. I hadn't meant to stay out visiting for so long. Gabe was less concerned about me venturing out on my own now that the rumor problem had been addressed and the rogue was being kept under lock and key. I was taking advantage of his more relaxed attitude and enjoying time out in the village. As I passed a squat brick house, I noticed a group of men moving down a side street toward me. I was prepared to ignore them until I recognized the man walking at the head of the small pack. It was Charles. I couldn't help but groan. There was no avoiding him. He'd definitely seen me already. As if he'd read my mind, he picked up the pace. I wanted to ignore him and keep going, but in a moment, the men would be blocking the sidewalk. I stopped and waited for him to approach me. There were 5 young men with him. They couldn't have been any older than me. Some of them looked familiar, but I didn't know any of them by name. 2 of them had brown hair. They looked like they could be brothers. There was a short, blonde man, a bearded man, and a redhead as well. I tried to commit each of their faces to memory. I didn't know what might happen here, but I would make sure that I could identify them again if I needed to. Charles had a phony smile on his face as he walked toward me. "I'm glad I found you," he said politely. "I was hoping to have a word with you. You could have come by the house if that was the case." I said suspiciously, "How could we have a heart-to-heart with Gabe and Val hovering over you?" He asked. I turned my head from side to side, making a show of looking at the men that had arrived with him. "This isn't exactly private either," I quipped. "I've come to you once before to ask you to do the right thing, and you didn't listen." "I thought that you may be swayed by numbers," he said dismissively. "It's time for you to leave for everyone's sake." I scoffed and crossed my arms. Of course, that was why he was here. Gabe told me all about the meeting they'd had.
Why Charles thought that Mama Ida or Giles would back him up is beyond me. It had to be clear to him by now that he was in the minority here.
So you brought some men I've never met to convince me? I asked.
We came to show you that Charles isn't the only one that wants you gone. One of the brunette ones said,
There's been nothing but trouble for the pack since you arrived. The other brunette agreed. Do us all a favor and just go back where you came from.
I stared at them steadily, all of who I demanded, the 6 of you. Do you think you speak for the entire pack?
We're the only ones brave enough to speak up, the redhead chimed in. Everyone else is too afraid of upsetting the alpha. But you're not, I said. You're the only ones brave enough to threaten a woman walking alone at night. How noble of you. I said sarcastically. No one is threatening you. Charles said coldly, we're asking you to put your selfish desires aside and leave. Before someone gets hurt, he stepped into my personal space and glared down at me. The sense of danger that washed over me put my wolf on edge. I glared back at him. After everything that's happened, if he really thought I would leave Gabe, he was insane. His proximity and the presence of these men wasn't going to be enough to make me change my mind. I stood my ground and refused to step back as he crowded me. I'm not intimidated by you, I said angrily. The fact that he was cornering me like this showed how weak his position was. He knew that he probably wasn't going to get his way. He just hoped that I would be scared enough that he could bully me into leaving. I'm not trying to intimidate you, he said. I laughed. Are you sure? Because this I motioned at the men standing in a semicircle around me. Seems pretty intimidating. One of the men took a step away from me, then glanced at the man next to him. I got the feeling he didn't realize the implications of this little meeting. Besides, I said, you already know that bribing me won't work. Intimidation is the only tactic you have left. That got a rumble from the other men, too. Anger flashed over his features before he schooled his expression. We only want what's best for the pack.
No, you want what's best for you. If I spat, what would the pack think if they knew what I so lied about and why? He spared her the shame of making that public.
What are you talking about? The young blonde man asked. I stared Charles down, waiting for him to offer some explanation. He looked at the man in irritation. Don't listen to her. I want Isel to recover from this, I said, despite what she did to me and how she insulted Val. Despite how she tried to manipulate Gabe into turning on Asa. I clenched my fists at my side. If I wasn't so determined to put this feud with Isolde and Charles behind me, I might just punch him. This got another rumble from the men. This time, the bearded man spoke up, turning on you. What do you mean? I was conflicted. These men clearly wanted the truth. Whatever lies Charles had told them to get them here were starting to unravel. I don't want this to hurt Isolde any more than it already has. I said I have a feeling she didn't realize how serious her accusation was. I glared at Charles. I had the feeling this had been his idea. The bearded man looked from me to Charles, and a knowing look came into his eye. He nodded at the blonde, and the two of them turned and walked away from me. I couldn't help but feel relieved. Having 4 men threatening me was still scary, but not as much as 6. Charles stepped into my personal space and glared down at me. It was that look of loathing he so often gave me. He looked at me like I was a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of his shoe. I've given you ample time to come to your senses and more than enough warnings, he whispered. This is your last chance. I stood my ground. I'm not going anywhere, I said sternly. Stubborn, stupid girl, he growled. How many signs do you need that you do not belong here? You're nothing, you're human, raised trash, unworthy of our offal. I do belong here, I shouted.
I am Gabe's mate. I said I wanted to scream. And I was the daughter of an alpha, no matter who raised me. But that would open a whole different can of worms, and this wasn't the time to make that information public. You are a. Charles's shout was cut short as he was seized by the shoulder and yanked away from me. I hadn't even seen Val approaching. There was a rage burning in his gray eyes that I'd never seen. He wrenched Charles away from me with such strength that the older man nearly toppled over. Have you lost your mind? Yeah, Val, see. Behind him, I could see the young blonde man and the bearded man rushing toward us. They must have gone to get help. I was immensely grateful to them for that. Charles straightened up and squared his shoulders. Am I not allowed to have a conversation? Val growled. The sound emanated from so deep within him that I wasn't sure it was really him at first. The rage that had seized his features shocked me. Val was always so calm and kind. Seeing him angry like this was frightening.
Leave, he bit out.
Now, a shiver ran down my spine, and his anger wasn't even aimed at me. Charles glared back at him, and for one long, tense moment, I thought that they were going to fight. The men who had come with Charles backed away from the confrontation. Gabe may be the most intimidating alpha around, but it was clear that Val wasn't to be trifled with either. Charles tore his eyes away from Val and glared at me. I met the look straight on and did my best not to let on that I was afraid. It's only a matter of time before the rest of the pack figures out who you really are, he said. I felt like my stomach dropped. Did he somehow know what Val and I had discovered about my family history? With his head held high and hatred on his face, he turned and stormed away from Val. And somehow I knew that this wasn't over yet. Chapter 39, Loss of a Reputation. My heart was pounding in my chest. Val was enraged in a way I'd never seen him. I felt frozen to the spot as the weight of the confrontation hit me. The men who had accompanied Charles looked just as uncertain and startled as I was. Gradually, they backed away from Val. None of them wanted to anger him further, and I didn't blame them. After an uncertain moment, the men followed Charles. Once Charles and the strange men were far enough away not to pose an immediate threat, Val turned to me. Are you all right? He asked. The look of rage fell from his face as if it had never been there, and concern took its place. I'm fine, I said softly, just a little freaked out. That was intense. I shook my head in an attempt to clear it. What do you think he meant? I asked softly. I'm not sure, Val said. He looked as concerned as I felt. If he knows about my parents and he starts telling people, won't the pack be upset? Considering the history with bare leg. Don't worry about that, he said calmly. Gabe and I will take care of that. What else did he say to you? What was all of that about? He told me to leave, I said softly. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. I considered telling him about the motel room bribe, but I didn't want to get into that. That bastard must have lost his mind, Val said in disbelief. I can't believe he would do something so brazen. He made his point, I said. He'll probably leave me alone now. Are you joking? Val balked. You have to go tell Gabe about this. I don't want to upset him, I said. Gabe was already annoyed about the situation with Charles. This would push him into anger. I didn't want to be the one responsible for telling him how things had escalated. Estelle, you have to tell him, Val said gently. I know, I said with a sigh. I know. Let me walk you to the house just in case those idiots are still lurking around out here, he said. I nodded and followed him as he started to walk down the street. We were close to the house anyway, so it would be silly to refuse. Of course, I was more than a little freaked out. That had been terrifying. I didn't want to let on how badly it had shaken me. But if Val hadn't come along when he did, I didn't even want to think about what might have happened.
Did those two guys go get you? I asked softly. They did, he answered. They said that you were in trouble. They were on board with Charles until he started to threaten me. I said softly, I'm glad they found you. It was lucky for me that Val had been nearby and that they had chosen to back out of the situation and look for him. It seemed that whatever hold Charles had over the pack, it was starting to waver. That might have been comforting if I didn't know how desperate a person could get when they lost their grip on power. Something more was at play here than his desire to see his daughter become the Luna. I had to wonder if that was really what had tipped him into this more extreme behavior or if it were something else entirely. When we got to the house, I went inside and Val headed home. He didn't like being away from Lucky right now, and I felt bad that he'd been dragged away for my sake. I wasn't sure how I was going to approach this topic with Gabe. I didn't know how he might react. If I was lucky, he'd only be a little annoyed with me for being out so late by myself. If I hadn't stopped to see Mama, I probably wouldn't have run into them. My reaction to the threats wasn't exactly great either. My attitude and flippant comments could have provoked him to action. Although, if he had been intent on hurting me, my actions wouldn't have made a difference one way or the other. It was becoming clear that Charles was unpredictable. Gabe was in his office. I tried to think of a reasonable excuse to put this off, but I couldn't. Besides, I'd promised Gabe that I would go to him the next time I was upset or afraid. I didn't want to break that promise again. It hadn't gone well for us the last time. I knocked and held my breath as I waited. I listened for him to call out, telling me to go away or come in. When no answer came, I raised my hand to knock again. Gabe opened the door and looked at me expectantly. I was startled and dropped my hand to my side. I hadn't heard him moving around in there at all. When I didn't speak right away, he pulled me into the room and closed the door. There were dozens of papers spread out on his desk and a small stack of books shoved to one corner. It was clear that he was hard at work on something. I felt bad that I was interrupting him with more ridiculous drama. What do you need? He asked. He went to his desk and began to examine the paperwork in front of him. I wasn't sure how to start. I bit my lip and sat in the chair across from his desk. I have to tell you something, I said softly. I'm worried that it's going to make you very angry, though. He pushed the papers in front of him aside and looked at me. His eyes roved over me, settling on my face. Are you hurt? He asked. No, not at all, I said quickly, just a little freaked out. What happened? Now that his full attention was on me, I felt silly. I looked down at my lap on my walk home tonight. Charles approached me with some guys that I don't know. He inhaled sharply through his nose and leaned back in his chair. I looked up at him. He was being careful to keep his face neutral, but I could see his nostrils flared in a way that told me he was angry. Val stepped in, I said quickly. I don't know who the guys were, but Val could tell you he just walked me home, but didn't come in. He wanted to get back to Lucky. You were alone when they approached you, though, he asked evenly. Yes, I said. Val offered to walk me home, but I wanted to stop and see Mama Ada. I ended up being out later than I meant to, and it was getting dark. That's fine, Gabe said. I was surprised to hear it, and he could obviously tell by my face. You should be able to go out by yourself any time of day and not worry about being harmed. I thought that with the rogue under lock and key, it would be safe for you to do so. His tone dropped in a way that let me know his anger was mounting. There should be no threat to anyone in my pack when they're within the village. He didn't hurt me. I said, how many people were with him? Gabe asked.
5, I said softly. He inhaled sharply and clenched his fist. I just needed to get this all out. If I hesitated and gave him bits and pieces like this, it would just drag things out and he'd end up angrier in the end.
Charles told me that he wanted me to leave. I said that I was nothing but trouble. The men agreed with him. They told me to go before someone got hurt.
Gabe growled. It was an obvious threat, and we both knew it. 2 of the men that were with him seemed to change their minds when they heard what I had to say. They ended up running to get Val, and he chased Charles off. Then he walked me home, I explained. Thank goodness for Val. He always seemed to be there when I needed him. I owed him so much. What did you say? He asked. His tone was much calmer than I'd expected. I looked up at him and found him staring at me with his hands steepled in front of his chin. That, I saw, was out of line, but we were trying to give her a chance to put this behind her and recover. I said, he looked thoughtful, and I swore he smiled a little. I shrugged and added, and that Charles doesn't intimidate me, so he was wasting his time. He laughed. I stared at him in surprise. I'd expected Gabe to be angry or at least annoyed with me. I'd baited Charles and could have made the whole situation worse. You think that's funny? I asked. It's hilarious, Gabe said with a chuckle. You undermined his authority in front of the men he was trying to show off for. You completely defamed him. You think so? I hadn't considered that when I spoke up for myself instead of reacting in fear, I would undermine Charles's authority. Absolutely. Gabe said he thought that he could bolster his power by displaying his strength over my mate, and you shut him down. Gabe stood and walked around the desk. I didn't think of it that way, I said softly. I stood when Gabe reached for my hand and happily allowed him to pull me into his arms. Your fearlessness is foolish, sometimes, he said, but it seems to serve you well. I thought you'd be mad at me. I admit it. For defending yourself, he asked. For escalating the situation. If I'd said the wrong thing and pissed him off. Gabe kissed the top of my head and held me close. It worries me, he said softly, but mostly it just pisses me off. Charles is trying my nerve. I know that you want to put this whole situation to rest and move on, but if he continues with these games of his, I will have to take action against him. I understand, I said softly. I just don't want the pack to be upset. I don't want anyone to feel like I made you choose between me and them. Anyone who thinks that is a fool, he said firmly, and Charles has to learn that this power struggle he thinks he's in doesn't exist. He's behaving like a petulant child and making a fool of himself. It's only a matter of time before that becomes apparent to the rest of the pack. Gabe was probably right, but I worried about what Charles might do when it got to that point. He wasn't going to take the loss of his reputation lying down. Chapter 34, back to Barrelite. Estelle was spending a lot of time with Lucky, and I was grateful for it. As her pregnancy progressed, it was harder for me to understand what she was experiencing. I did my best to take care of her and make sure that she didn't have to lift a finger if she didn't want to, but there was only so much that I could do. Having another woman to talk to about her experience helped. Estelle was so fascinated with the entire process. I knew it wouldn't be long before Gabe had a little one on the way too. The pack was finally stable enough that it felt safe for us to start a family. My anxiety over the pregnancy was driving me a little mad. I did my best to hide it from Lucky. I didn't want her to have any additional stress to manage. The best thing that I could do to assuage my fears was to prepare for our pup's arrival. It was still many months away, but it was never too early to get ready. I'd already renovated the guest room in our home to be a nursery. There was no furniture yet, but that's because Lucky was still deciding what she wanted until she decided. I was at a standstill. I would just have to find another activity to occupy my anxious mind. Looking into Estelle's parentage had filled that need for a while, but we'd found the answer we had been seeking. Estelle still had questions, but she hadn't approached me about continuing the search. I got the impression that she was afraid of what we might find. This left me with little to occupy my admittedly minimal free time. Lucky's parents were set to arrive tomorrow, so she was spending the day with Estelle and getting ready. She was nervous. It had been years since she'd seen them, and she was uncertain about how her father would react. He was a strict man who disapproved of her choice to leave the village. She hoped for his approval, but wasn't confident that she would get it. I only hoped that he would be kind to her. Lucky did a lot of good with the skills she learned in the human world. I could see no reason for him to feel anything but pride for his daughter. It would also be my first time meeting her parents. They had written to Lucky sporadically over the years, and she had told them about me. But that was the extent of the interaction she'd had with them since we met. I was nervous about this visit too. If they upset Lucky, I didn't know what I might do. I wasn't generally a nervous man, but ever since I'd learned of Lucky's pregnancy, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me. If there was anything I could do to ease the feeling that followed me, I would do it. That's why I'd come to the library. The chief concern for me at the moment was Charles after his confrontation with Estelle and the vague threat he'd made. My distrust for him was nearing paranoia. Gabe was conflicted by the situation, as angry as he was about the treatment of his mate. Charles was still the man who raised him. It was understandable that he had reacted harshly to the ousting of his daughter. It in no way excused his treatment of Estelle, but it was enough to temper Gabe's reaction. The conflict was hard for him, and I understood that, but I did not trust Charles. I couldn't put aside my dislike of the man any longer. The way he'd been looking at Estelle when I'd intervened was so hostile. I didn't doubt for a moment that if I hadn't arrived when I did, he would have hurt her. I didn't want to speculate on how far he would have gone, but he'd shown over the past few months that he would sink to depths none of us could have imagined from him before. After the comment Charles made about finding out who Estelle really is, I couldn't help wondering if there was some information that I was missing about the Bear Lake attack. Records of the attack were sparse and incomplete, but I wanted to see if there was anything that might shed some light on what had happened. We needed a librarian. The documents were in such disarray that before I could properly start my search, I had to pull everything relevant from the shelves and try to organize it. I ended up with a stacks of records laid out on the table before me. It was hard to look at these documents. Most of them were lists of casualties and shaky first-hand, personal accounts of the night. It must have been my imagination, but the acrid stench of fire seemed to cling to the paper. It was hard not to think about my own experience that night, but I did my best to push those painful memories aside. In a dusty and moth-eaten stack of loosely bound papers, I found preserved correspondence between the pack. Invitations to visit from relatives and letters of congratulations about births were numerous. It was hard to reconcile the joyous tone of the letters with the violence that would erupt just a few days later. We really had been one big extended family. How did it all go so wrong? Estelle's parents wouldn't have mounted such a viscous attack with a pup on the way, would they? Why take the risk? A letter stamped with the star flower crest of the Bear Lake Alpha was lying at the bottom of the stack of papers. I looked it over twice before I could be certain that I was understanding it correctly. It was a letter confirming an official visit from a delegation of our pack just 2 days before the attack. I didn't remember the Alpha leaving at that point. He hadn't traveled much after Gabe was born.
Whoever he sent in his place must have known something about the cause of the attack. There were no names listed on the letter, and no way to confirm that whoever was sent was even still alive. I set the letter aside and ran my fingers through my hair. It was frustrating not being able to find the answer. I grabbed the next stack of papers and started to flip through them. I scanned the reports of the attack quickly, trying not to absorb too many of the details. I just looked for anything odd that might stand out from the other accounts of fire, blood, and bodies. Halfway through the reports, I paused. Not many of the reports contained dialogue, so this one caught my eye. In the center of the document, the writer recorded what they heard some of the attackers saying. Chanting to be more accurate, return our Luna. The woman who had made this report died several years ago, and I wouldn't be able to follow up with her. I quickly flipped through the rest of the reports, and none of them contained similar information. I looked at the quote again, return our Luna. It was possible that she had misheard. The sound of the violence was so loud, I couldn't remember a word that I'd heard that day. It was mostly a cacophony of screams. But if she was right, it meant that Estelle's mother had gone missing while she was pregnant. 2 days prior, a delegation from our pack had visited. I tossed the file onto the table and stood up. This couldn't be right. I paced beside the table, trying to make sense of what I had just read. Was it possible that they thought our delegation had kidnapped their Luna? It would explain the viciousness of the assault. The timing couldn't be a coincidence, could it? For the next several hours, I pored over every paper that I could find related to the Bear Lake Pack. It was emotionally draining, but if I stopped now, I would lose my momentum. If I let the feelings roiling within me settle now, I would never finish this search. My own memories of the horror were already lurking just below the surface of my consciousness. I knew that the nightmares would start again after that. There were various references to the Luna's pregnancy, which confirmed the timeline. I'd assumed Estelle must have been born just after the attack. Where was her mother when the attack happened? She hadn't been here. There was no way anyone in our pack would have kidnapped her. There would have been no reason to. This made no sense. The answers were just out of reach. It was maddening. If this was a factor in what was happening with Estelle and Charles, then I needed to find out. Besides that, I'd spent most of my life trying to rationalize what had happened to us. There had to be a reason our greatest allies had turned on us. The flowers that had been left just over our border was a tantalizing clue that I couldn't make heads or tails of. Did someone from Bear Lake know that Estelle was the child of their lost Luna? How could they know? What was the point of the hit that was put out on her? Why was her presence here drawing so much attention from outside of the pack? I needed to find the answers for the sake of the pack and the safety of our alpha and soon-to-be Luna. I had to figure this out. Lucky's parents would arrive in the morning. She wouldn't be alone. Estelle would be by her side as well. She would be in good hands if I was away for a short time. I had been to Bear Lake as a child, and I knew the way I could make the trip tonight and be back by tomorrow afternoon, this early evening at the latest. I could run much faster than anyone else in the pack. If I asked Gabe's permission, I would have to wait for a traveling party to be assembled, and they would just slow me down. Besides, if I arrived with a force and did find a settlement of Bear Lake survivors, it could be construed as an attack. I didn't want to cause any further confusion. I just needed answers. Had someone from our pack hurt their Luna, the question wouldn't leave my mind. It was dangerous, it was probably foolish, but I couldn't shake the sense of urgency. I didn't want to bring my child into the world with the specter of that terror hanging over us. The tragedy of our betrayal had to be resolved. There was no other way to further my search for an explanation. I tore a piece of paper from a nearby notebook and scribbled a note to Lucky. She would be furious with me. But I had to find out.
I grabbed the relevant documents and folded them until I could shove them into my pocket. Then I headed for the door.
This part is ended. Thank you for listening. If you would like to continue listening to the next part, please let me know by leaving a comment